Hey everyone, Cole here with Classic Mini DIY, and on today's episode we're going to install a differential, we're going to preload it, and we might even get to our crankcase cover. So stay tuned. Now, like I said, today is the day that we're going to install the differential on our remote gearbox. What that also means is that we're going to need to install the roller bearings on here. That has to get preloaded, which I'm going to explain that whole process here in just a minute. And then I'm going to show you guys how to set up your crankcase cover with your drop gears and all that jazz. So, pretty exciting stuff today. Before we get started, I want to thank 7 Mini Parts, our parts sponsor for this build and all the episodes here on Classic Mini DIY. Thank you so much for providing the parts for this and for all of the builds that I do on this channel. If you guys are in North America and you need mini parts, 7 Mini Parts is the premier place to pick those up. Links to their website are in the description below. But let's get started. All right, so first up we are going to install our roller bearings on our differential here. Now getting these off, I did that in another episode, so if you're looking to see how to get the differential bearings off, head back into the past videos for this build and you'll find that there. But you'll also notice, you might notice that this output shaft is not the standard output shaft that you would see on a remote gearbox. I'm going to do this for the person who's coming after me, but these are CV style pot joint output shafts, and what this is going to allow the next person, whoever gets this engine, to do is to put CV joints on here instead of those coupling joints with the big bulky U-joint things. So whoever gets it next won't have to use these and will be able to use a modern CV joint, which I think whoever gets this is going to be happy about, unless they're going for absolute 100% originality, but in my opinion it's much better with the CV joints. Now, this bearing just needs to get pushed down on here. The best way that I have found to do this is by getting yourself a socket like this and just hammering the top of the socket and moving that bearing face down the face of your differential. So let's do that. Now, one thing a lot of people end up leaving out of their rebuild jobs for whatever reason is this outer race that sits in your transfer case. So this hole right here is where your actual crankshaft goes through. This is your drop gear, and then this right here is where your main shaft slots into. Now you can see there's a race in there. It's extremely important that on every rebuild you do, you replace this. These are notorious for wearing, and replacing it is extremely important. Now what goes in here is actually a roller bearing, so this doesn't have the rollers in it. It's taken out because I'm about to show you guys how to put that on the end of your final motion shaft. But on this end, you need to get this old race out and put your new one in. Now, in order to do this, you have to do a couple things. First thing I would recommend doing is picking up a tool called a blind bearing puller. So this has a small thing that slots down in, and you can see there's cutouts in this because when you tighten this down, it's going to expand into the smaller space underneath. So you can see here, I've set this down in here, and we're going to tighten this sucker down. The easiest way to do this, of course, is with a set of adjustable wrenches, just like this. And what we want is for that to expand underneath that bearing so that when we try and pull this out, it's going to actually come out. Now, once you have that bearing puller in its place, the next step is to install our puller and start pulling this sucker out of here. Now, it shouldn't be too difficult, but if it is, you can warm up the casing just a little bit with a small torch. But as you can see here, well, it's just out of frame, but you're just going to have to trust me. I'm actually spinning this with my hand. The bearing actually came out so easily in this scenario. I didn't actually have to use a wrench at all. I could do this all by hand. Now I'm going to warn you, it's not usually that easy, but luckily in this case it was. So we'll take that old bearing off, and we'll clean up the space down in here really, really well. And then what we're gonna do is get our new race. And our new race has actually been sitting in my freezer for probably 24 hours now. It's important because that piece is now gonna be shrunk down nice and small, and it should go in here with relative ease. So I'm gonna grab that and we can push that down in here. Now with this race, there's not too much funny business about it. It doesn't have a specific way it goes in. It's the same either way, but you can see because it's been shrunk down, it sits down in there pretty easily. But what we're gonna do is take our old bearing race and we're gonna use our old race to whack this down in here. Now, this is a technique, this is a great way to keep from damaging the new race because you're using the force of the old race. You're using the force of the old race to set that down in there. And with that, you have your new race inserted. This bearing was already replaced. I forgot to hit record on that. So I'm really sorry about that. But it has the same process, bearing puller to pop that out. Some people also use a grease technique. I've never tried it before, so I don't really know how it works. But you can find that stuff online. However, you can see here, this race is set all the way down in there. There's a small retaining ring at the bottom, and then the new roller bearing will be able to sit down in here with its rollers once those are reinstalled and on the final motion shaft. Now, speaking of the final motion shaft, let's move over to that, and we're gonna put the actual race on the end here. As you can see, all the rollers are out. It makes it a lot easier to put this on. Pop that on there. And we're probably gonna have to use a torch for this. So I know you guys are excited. Let's get some fire out. Now with this piece you're gonna find it's a pretty big curmudgeon when it comes to getting this on here. If there's any burrs at all on the end of this, which mine doesn't have any, but you might still need to file it down a little bit, which will help set that bearing down on there. But in any case, most of the time, you're simply gonna end up having to use a torch to light this up, get it warm, not really warm, and then you're gonna have to hammer this sucker on here. So get yourself a set of pliers like this and go ahead and we're gonna heat this sucker up real good. We are gonna take our ball peen hammer and we're gonna do our best to knock this sucker on here. Now, once you have that race set all the way down on there, the next step is to reinstall your actual rollers here. Now, keep in mind, this is gonna be really hot if you were just using a torch, so don't immediately put this on here, otherwise you're gonna melt your race, and then you're gonna have to take this whole thing back off, and trust me, you don't wanna do that. As you can see, it's not the easiest job to get that on there, and it's even harder to get it off. Now there is, however, one thing that you can put on while you wait for this to cool, and that is your snap ring or your locking ring. This goes on right around the top edge there, sits down into that groove, just like that, and it helps retain that. I don't know why they put that on there. There's no way in hell that thing's ever coming off, but whatever, there's a retainer there, you gotta put it on. All right, and with that cooled down, we can go ahead and set our bearing race back in there, and what we'll start doing is put our little rollers back in here. It's not too hard, you just kind of push them into place one by one. Now, one of the other reasons that it's so important to change that race every time you do this is that this little roller race right here is mated specifically to the race that sits inside your inside your transfer case. They are sold as a set, they're meant to go in as a set, and you might find that when you try and put a new roller race here into an old outer race, it doesn't fit. And that's because, as I said, they are mated to each other for life, just like swans. And there we go. Connected up and ready to roll. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to be doing is installing our differential here. Now, installing this diff is not, unfortunately, as easy as just putting it in there, putting this cover on here, and calling it a day. There are a few things you have to do prior to actually setting the cover on like this. Now, before I get into those, I do want to mention, you might notice I have some studs here, and then one stud right down here, but there's an empty hole here, and you can't see it, but there's an empty hole over here. Now, normally, all of those are studs, but in my case, I am actually going to be using bolts for 2 of the holes, leaving this main studs right here to actually tighten down that back cover, that diff cover. Now, before we can get to any of that, we do need to do something called preloading the differential. Now, that is done by installing your output cover on one side here, with the gasket. It's very important that's included. Once you have that installed with 2 bolts down on the bottom here, you'll take a rubber mallet, tap this sucker this direction as far as it can go. What that's going to do is put the bearing over here up against this output cover. It's going to be fully pinched onto that. And then what we're going to be doing is adding shims to this side right here until we can shim this up to 0 clearance. And what that means is not pinching, not sandwiching these bearings down on there, but actually a 0 clearance. So these are sold in an assortment of different sizes, thicknesses, if you will. So these 2, for instance, are very thick. This one's pretty skinny. They're all sold in different thicknesses. And basically what you need to do is stack these up until you have 0 clearance. A feeler gauge can't fit in between these shims and this output cover on this side, with the gasket installed as well. So to save a little bit of time, I've already figured out the shim thickness here that I need. So mine is already set up, but basically what you have to do is go back and forth. So you put some shims in there, tighten this all up, and then you measure the space in between the shims and the output cover. If there's still space, note the space, get a shim that is going to match that gap that's still in there, add another shim. If you have it sandwiched down and there's no clearance whatsoever, I would encourage you to remove a few shims just to make sure that it's not pinching it and it's just a perfect 0 clearance. So with that out of the way, I'm very happy to say that that is done. The next thing that we're going to need to do is actually install our back cover. Now on the remote shift gearbox, you have a little bit different output cover. You can see this big sandwich plate right here. This is made to go out to the shift assembly. On a rod change gearbox, you basically just have, it's almost, well, it's as flat as it can be, given that there's a big gear inside there, and then there's a small hole right here. If you guys have a rod change gearbox, I do have videos on how to completely rebuild a rod change gearbox already made, and those are the ones you're probably going to want to check out. In this case, this is the remote gearbox rebuild, and what we'll need to do is install our 2 gaskets. You have one that goes on the bottom here with a slightly thicker side. That will fall right down over these posts just like that. And then you have one that goes up top. Now with these gaskets, you're going to want to make sure that there's none hanging over on the side here and none rubbing up against the bearing. You want these to be as flush as possible, because when you put the output covers on, they have their own gaskets that also need to sandwich and make a tight, nice seal. Now, if you have watched the channel for a while, you know I like gasket sealer. And this area is one of the most important places, in my opinion, to add gasket sealer. So what I'm gonna do is get some gasket sealer, put that on there, and then we're gonna slide this output cover down on top of this gearbox and start getting everything tightened down to spec. Now before these get too tight down on there, you're going to want to go ahead and install your output covers with the gaskets on them, because sometimes lining up these bolt holes has been a little bit difficult after this cover has been torqued down. And don't forget these shims. It would be very frustrating to get this on here and have forgotten those shims. So now when we get to actually tightening these nuts down and these screws down, it's extremely important that they're done by hand, because these transmission case bolts have a really big tendency to strip. So doing them by hand is probably one of the most important things when you're doing this job. So you can see all of those are only finger tight right now until I get the actual cover up here tightened down. And there we have it. We have an installed diff cover or diff output. So all the shift assembly stuff does need to go in still. As you can see, there's an emptiness here, an emptiness here. All of those are used for actually managing your shifts and your gear changes. And I have all of the shafts right over here. So let me get those together for you, and then we'll get all this stuff assembled, and then really the gearbox will be pretty much done, aside for the transfer case right over here. All right, so this next part is where a lot of people feel things get pretty darn confusing. I'm here to tell you it's not actually as confusing as it all seems. So first thing that we're gonna do is take our little fork here. You can see there's a bent side and a straight side, and it goes in just like this, right inside this slot here. Now this is going to move free once we get our shaft in there, but we do need a few things. So in between this little unit here, you need rubber bushings. That helps reduce vibrations, it helps quiet things down, but it also just kind of tightens everything up in here. You also have some on the outside, followed by some washers. So I'm going to start assembling this, and you guys can see exactly how this works. You have a shaft with cotter pin holes in it. Now this is going to go through just like this, and this shouldn't have any sort of resistance. If you've got resistance here, you might need to pilot out this hole and ream it. That's a little bit out of my skill set, so I'm not exactly sure what would need to happen there. But go ahead and get these washers in there. Just like that. And so now you've got your shaft sitting in there. The next step is to take 2 rubber washers on the outside here, and then we put our metal washers on, and we're going to need a cotter pin for this. One thing that I think is really worth having is just an assortment of various different size cotter pins for just a scenario where you might find that you need a cotter pin and maybe a kit didn't come with something, or you know, whatever. It helps in this kind of situation. So we'll slide these on just like that. Now that should be pretty tight in there, the shaft itself, and then this is still going to be loosey-goosey. So what you have here is a special kind of system. You have a shaft that actually runs through the housing right up here and out this hole here. When this slides up in there, this hole right here needs to be located into this little dangly bit, and this round end here needs to be facing upwards. So we're going to take that, locate it into that hole, let that sit right down in there, and as you can see, that's free. It's going to want to try and get out on you. So if you're going to sit here for a minute, it is definitely worth it to get a little zip tie, something like that, to help you hold this in place. Now obviously this is only a temporary setup, but the reason we need to do that is because, well, I don't have 45 hands, so it's not the easiest thing here. Now it's very important. Do you see how this shaft spins right here? You need to line it up perfectly straight. And then we have a very special unit. It's this right here. Now this is going to slide over. You can see there's small teeth on this. This slides over and a bolt goes through that groove right there. Now it's really important that this gets lined up perfectly here, because it's super easy for it to be like just 1, maybe 2 teeth off. So once that's lined up there, There is a special bolt, goes right through here, just like that. And you should be able to do this with your hand relatively easily here, at least to get it started. And now that's in place. You can see it's still free here. Now with this unit installed now, you are able to remove this zip tie because you do want this to be free in order to put on the next piece, which is the socket. Goes on just the same way with a bolt that holds it in. And as you can see, with this installed, it doesn't allow it to fall out, which is the main reason we zip tied it prior. Now, just like before, you're going to take this opportunity to line up the grooves on that so that the screw will pass through the groove on the actual shaft coming out of the gearbox. That's going to allow you to tighten this up. And then last, don't forget that little grease fitting there and then tightening down your cotter pins. Okay, so that wraps up the remote gearbox. There is obviously still more stuff we gotta do in order to mate it to the engine itself, the early 998 engine. But as far as the gearbox goes, that's everything. It's pretty exciting stuff. I'm so glad this is finally done here. As you can see, the idler gear is installed. This is something that I wanted to cover in its own episode, really right before we put it on the engine. So don't worry, I haven't forgotten that. But as you can see, it's really coming together nicely. If you guys have any questions, as usual, please post them in the comment section below. I'll do my best to answer anything you guys might have that might pop up. A big thank you to both 7 Mini Parts, my parts sponsor. They provided 99% of the parts here. Also, a huge thank you to Guessworks. He also sent me over some really hard to find parts all the way from the UK. Both of those companies I cannot say enough good stuff about. If you have any parts needs in North America, check out 7 Mini Parts. If you have gearbox related things and you're overseas, check out Guessworks. They are awesome. Also, a huge thank you to my patrons. You guys make videos like this possible. While I am sponsored by 7 Mini Parts, I do pay for those parts, and you guys help me pay for parts to cover big, complex jobs like this. If you're interested in supporting the channel directly, head over to patreon.com/classicminidiy, and there are lots of support tiers with all sorts of fun benefits associated with them. So with that, I'm gonna wrap this video up. Don't forget there is a giveaway going on right now for a set of Spax shock absorbers. Link to that is in the description. But until the next episode, and until I see you guys again, enjoy those minis and motor on.